Here's a question no soldier should ever have to ask. Why doesn't my house's key work anymore? Spoiler alert, it wasn't because I lost it. It was because while I was dodging bullets overseas, someone here decided an unpaid fee that I didn't even owe was grounds to steal everything I'd built. The part that really gets you? They didn't even break in. They had paperwork. Welcome to the most bizarre home invasion story you'll ever hear, brought to you by your friendly neighborhood HOA. Curious how an $800 ghost fee led to a $300,000 disaster? Stick around. This isn't just about locks, keys, or money. It's about a system that thinks silence means surrender. And trust me, I had a lot to say when I got back. I bought my house in the spring of 2006 after 10 years of military service and saving every penny I could. It was a modest 3-bedroom in a quiet suburb of Colorado Springs. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Or at least, that's what I thought when I signed those papers. $300,000. Paid in full, no mortgage. My commanding officer thought I was crazy for not investing the money, but I had my reason. A soldier needs roots, I told him, something to come home to. But more importantly, I needed a place for my mother to live. At 68, with her health declining, she couldn't keep living alone in that old apartment across the country. The plan was perfect. I'd do one more tour in Iraq, 15 months, and then come home and bring her to live with me. A real home for both of us after years of moving around with the Army. I remember the day I showed her the house. She walked through each room slowly, touching the walls like she couldn't believe it was real. "It's beautiful, Logan," she said, tears in her eyes. "I can't wait to live here with you." I promised her it would happen. Just 15 more months, one last tour. I should have known that life rarely follows our carefully laid plans. Before deploying, I handled everything meticulously, the way the Army taught me. I paid my HOA fees for the entire year in advance, $500 per quarter, $2,000 total. I arranged for my neighbor, Steve Johnson, to check on the place periodically. I even went to the HOA office personally to inform them I'd be deployed to Iraq and wouldn't be reachable except by email in emergencies. The HOA president at the time, an older gentleman named Richard Miller, was understanding. He took notes, shook my hand, and thanked me for my service. "Don't worry about a thing," he said. "We'll make sure everything's taken care of while you're gone." 2 weeks later, I was on a transport plane to Iraq. What I didn't know then was that Richard Miller resigned a month after I left, citing health concerns. His replacement was Patricia Winters, a 42-year-old local real estate agent with bleach blonde hair who always wore designer clothes that somehow still looked disheveled. The board voted her in unanimously, mostly because no one else wanted the job. From what I later learned, her first order of business was reviewing all the properties in the neighborhood, with special attention to those with potential issues. My empty house caught her eye immediately. The first violation notice arrived at my empty house 6 weeks after I'd deployed. The grass was apparently half an inch taller than regulation height. The fine was $50. The second notice came a week later. My garbage can had been left out past collection time. Another $50. Never mind that Steve had encountered a delay at work and couldn't get there until evening. By the time he finally checked my mailbox 3 weeks into my deployment, there were already 5 violation notices totaling $250. Steve was confused. He'd been maintaining the property well within reason, but he didn't understand the severity of the situation. He left me a vague message, "Hey Logan, there are some notices from the HOA. Nothing major, I'll handle it." But he couldn't handle it. Patricia had made sure of that. That night, as I lay on my cot in the sweltering heat of Fallujah, writing a letter to my mother about the home we would share, Patricia Winters stood on my front lawn, surveying my property with hungry eyes. "This corner lot would sell for a premium," she said to a man in an expensive suit beside her. "We just need to find a way to make the owner violate the HOA regulations." What she didn't know was that her plan would eventually cost her everything. The violation notices continued to pile up in my mailbox throughout that summer, each one more ridiculous than the last. A small paint chip on the window trim, $75. A branch that extended 3 inches over the sidewalk, $100. A non-approved welcome mat, $50. Patricia and her ally on the board, Robert Keller, were meticulous in their documentation, taking close-up photos that made minor imperfections look like major problems. They never sent these notices to my email address, the one I had specifically provided to the HOA before leaving. Instead, they sent everything to my empty house, knowing full well there was no one there to receive them. Steve tried his best, but he traveled frequently for his insurance job. Sometimes weeks would pass before he could check on the house. By the time he realized something serious was happening, the alleged debt had grown to $800. He called the HOA office and spoke to Patricia directly, explaining that I was deployed in Iraq. Her response was chilling in its calculated indifference. The rules apply to everyone, regardless of their circumstances. If Mr. Carter can't maintain his property according to HOA standards, perhaps he shouldn't own a home in our community. When Steve mentioned that I had paid my HOA dues in advance, Patricia claimed there was no record of such payment. What Steve didn't know was that Patricia had discovered a vague clause in the HOA bylaws. Section 12, paragraph 4, stated that after 3 months of unpaid fines and violations, the association could place a lien on the property. After 6 months, they could begin foreclosure proceedings. This clause had never been enforced in the neighborhood's history until Patricia decided to test its limits. One of the few decent people on the HOA board, Diane Thomas, a retired schoolteacher, raised concerns during a meeting. "Shouldn't we be making extra allowances for active military personnel?" she asked, "especially someone fighting overseas?" Patricia dismissed her concerns with a wave of her manicured hand. The rules are the rules. If we make exceptions, where do we draw the line? Robert Keller, the HOA's lawyer and Patricia's closest ally, nodded in agreement. "Besides," he added, "we've sent multiple notices. If he cared about his property, he would have responded by now." What they deliberately failed to mention was that they knew exactly why I wasn't responding. By September, 5 months into my deployment, Patricia had gathered enough evidence of violations to present to the board. In a closed-door meeting, with only select members present, they voted to place a lien on my property. Diane Thomas voted against it, but she was outnumbered. "This doesn't feel right," she protested. "He's serving our country." Patricia's response was coldly pragmatic, "and we're serving our community by maintaining property values. No one is above the rules." The motion passed, and the clock started ticking toward foreclosure. Meanwhile, I remained completely unaware of what was happening. In Iraq, my unit was engaged in some of the heaviest fighting of the war. Communications were sporadic at best. When I finally got access to email again after a 2-week blackout period, there was nothing from the HOA. Only a vague message from Steve saying he was handling some issues with the house, but nothing to worry about. If only he had known the truth. The final notice, the one announcing impending foreclosure, was sent certified mail to my empty house in October. Since no one was there to sign for it, it was returned to the HOA office. Patricia filed it away with a smile, marking the date when foreclosure proceedings could legally begin. "We need to be very careful here," Robert advised during a private conversation in her office. "There are federal laws protecting active-duty military from foreclosure." Patricia's response showed her true intentions. "Only if they know to invoke those protections. Besides, we're not a bank. Those rules were meant for mortgage lenders, not HOAs. It was a legal gray area and she knew it, but she was counting on me never finding out until it was too late." On a cold November morning, while I was pulling a wounded comrade to safety during a night raid in Fallujah, Patricia Winters was signing papers authorizing the HOA to foreclose on my $300,000 home. "The auction will happen quickly," she told Robert. "No need for widespread notification. We just need enough participants to make it legal." Robert nodded, a greedy smile spreading across his face. "And with a starting bid of just $3,500, I think we've already got a buyer lined up." They had planned everything perfectly, or so they thought, but they had overlooked one crucial detail. Information has a way of reaching a soldier, even in a war zone. I'll never forget the day I learned what was happening to my house. Our unit had just returned from a 72-hour mission securing a route between Baghdad and Fallujah. I was exhausted, covered in dust, and had lost 2 friends to an IED the day before. When the communications officer told me there was an urgent message from home, my first thought was my mother. Instead, it was Steve, and his news was almost as devastating. "Logan, you need to call me as soon as you get this," his email read. "The HOA is foreclosing on your house. There's a notice on your door saying it will be auctioned next week." The message had been sent 3 days earlier. I immediately requested emergency communications access to make a call back to the States. "They're saying you owe $800 in fines and late fees," Steve explained. "I tried to pay it myself, but they refused to take payment from anyone but the property owner. These violations, they're claiming, they're ridiculous. A branch too long, grass half an inch too tall. It's absurd." I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. After all I'd sacrificed, I was about to lose my $300,000 home over $800 in fabricated violations. I immediately tried to contact the HOA. My first email bounced back. They had changed their contact information. I finally found a general contact form on their website and sent an urgent message explaining my situation as an active duty soldier deployed in Iraq, citing the Service Members Civil Relief Act, SCRA. I received no response. I then spent 2 hours researching my rights under SCRA and contacted the military's Legal Assistance Office. Captain James Rivera confirmed my fears. What they're doing violates federal law, he explained. The CRA specifically prohibits foreclosures against active duty military without a court order, but you need someone stateside who can represent you. I explained that I was in a combat zone with limited ability to find and hire a lawyer from halfway around the world. I can help with paperwork, Rivera offered, but you need boots on the ground there. My mother was too elderly and lived too far away. Steve was willing but lacked legal knowledge. My savings were nearly depleted after buying the house. The weight of it all pressed down on me as I sat in the communications tent. This house was supposed to be my foundation, my mother's future home. Now it was being stolen while I was risking my life for my country. I spent the next 48 hours sending emails to every contact I could think of, the HOA, local government offices, veteran support groups. Most went unanswered. The HOA continued to ignore me completely. The auction was scheduled for Monday, and it was already Thursday. Then, on Friday, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Steve had reached out to our local news station, and a reporter interested in veteran issues had started asking questions. Suddenly, Patricia Winters was responding to emails claiming there had been a misunderstanding. It was a stalling tactic, buying time until the auction could be completed. That hope was short-lived. On Sunday, I received an email from Steve with an attached photo that made my blood run cold. It showed my house with a sold sign planted in the front yard. The auction had been moved up without notice. My $300,000 house had been sold for $3,500 to an unknown buyer. I sat on my cot that night staring at the canvas ceiling. Around me, other soldiers prepared for the next day's mission, cleaning weapons, checking gear. I had faced insurgent attacks and the constant threat of death without breaking. But this betrayal, this theft of my future while I served my country, broke something inside me. Sergeant Martinez noticed my unusual silence and sat beside me. "Logan, you okay?" he asked. I looked up, the shock transforming into determination. "I'm going to get my house back," I said, "and the people who did this are going to pay." I managed to secure emergency leave based on the illegal foreclosure of my home. 2 weeks later, I was on a transport plane heading back to the United States. I hadn't slept properly in days, running on a dangerous mix of adrenaline, caffeine, and determination. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that "sold" sign on my lawn. I landed at Colorado Springs Airport, still wearing my desert fatigues. The familiar landscape felt strangely alien now, as if I were seeing it through different eyes. I drove straight to my house, or what used to be my house. The neighborhood looked the same. Neat lawns, trimmed hedges, American flags flying from several porches. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, except that I no longer belonged here. As I pulled up, the first thing I noticed was that someone had repainted the front door, a bright red instead of the navy blue I had chosen. New curtains hung in the windows, a different welcome mat lay at the entrance, and where my name had once been on the mailbox, there was now Henderson. I sat in the rental car for a long moment, trying to process the reality in front of me. I finally got out and approached the door. Before I could reach for the doorbell, I noticed a large plastic container at the side of the garage. These were my belongings: photos, books, kitchenware, clothes, haphazardly thrown into containers like garbage. I reached in and pulled out a framed photo of my mother and me at my basic training graduation. The glass was cracked. Next came my grandfather's watch and my military service medals loose among old t-shirts. The front door opened and a woman in her 30s appeared. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyeing my uniform with confusion. I straightened up, still holding the framed photo. "My name is Logan Carter," I said. "This was my house. I just got back from Iraq and discovered it was sold while I was deployed." Her expression changed to alarm. "Michael, you need to come out here right now." A man joined her in the doorway, his face immediately tensing at the sight of me in uniform. "Look, we bought this house legally at an auction," Michael Henderson said, his voice defensive but uncertain. We have all the paperwork. If there's a problem, you need to take it up with the homeowners association. His wife nodded, though I could see doubt in her expression. We had no idea, she added. We were told the owner had abandoned the property. If we'd known you were military, overseas... I tried to maintain composure, but seeing strangers in my home, claiming ownership while my belongings sat in containers outside, pushed me to the edge. I need to see the paperwork for this sale, I said. This house was paid for. I owned it outright. I was in Iraq, serving this country, and I had paid my HOA fees in advance. This sale was illegal under federal law. While Michael retrieved the documents, his wife, Emily, stood awkwardly in the doorway. Your things, she said, gesturing to the containers. We didn't know what to do with them. The HOA president said you'd abandon the property, but it didn't feel right just throwing everything away. Michael returned with a folder. Here's everything we have from the sale, he said reluctantly. I scanned the documents quickly. The sale price was indeed just $3,500 for a house worth $300,000. The auction had been held with only 4 bidders present, and most damning of all, there was no court order authorizing the foreclosure, which was explicitly required by the SCRA for properties owned by active duty military personnel. This sale was illegal, I said, pointing to the relevant sections. Under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, they needed a court order to foreclose on an active service member's property. The Hendersons exchanged worried glances. We paid for this house, Michael said, his voice hardening. We've already started renovations. We can't just hand it back because of some technicality. The confrontation might have escalated further, but a police car pulled up to the curb. Someone had called them about a soldier in uniform having what appeared to be an argument with the new homeowners. The officer approached cautiously. Everything okay here? He asked. Officer, my name is Sergeant Logan Carter. I just returned from deployment in Iraq to find that my house was illegally foreclosed on and sold while I was overseas. The officer looked between us, clearly trying to assess the situation. This is a civil matter, he finally said. I can't determine property ownership here, but Sergeant, I'd advise you to contact a lawyer immediately if you believe your rights under SCRA have been violated. It wasn't the resolution I wanted, but it was reasonable advice. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at my house, the house that should have been a sanctuary for my mother and me. Instead of feeling defeated, I felt a cold, focused anger taking hold, the kind of focused determination that had kept me alive in combat. This wasn't over. I pulled out my phone and searched for military law attorney Colorado Springs. The first name that came up was Michael Turner, a former JAG officer who specialized in SCRA cases. I dialed immediately. Mr. Turner's office, a receptionist answered. I need to speak with him right away, I said. My name is Sergeant Logan Carter, and my house was illegally taken while I was serving in Iraq. There was a brief pause. Hold one moment, Sergeant. I think Mr. Turner will want to speak with you immediately. Michael Turner's office was modestly furnished but immaculately organized, much like the man himself. In his early 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the ramrod-straight posture that marked him as former military, Turner listened intently as I laid out my situation. I showed him the auction documents from the Hendersons, my deployment orders, bank statements proving I'd paid the HOA fees in advance, and emails I'd sent to the HOA from Iraq that had gone unanswered. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of anger and determination that mirrored my own feelings. What they've done is not just unethical, it's blatantly illegal, he said, tapping the documents spread across his desk. The Service Members Civil Relief Act explicitly prohibits foreclosures against active duty military without a court order. They knew you were deployed, you notified them before leaving, and they proceeded anyway. He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. We're going to file for an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning. That should freeze any further property transfers or renovations until we can get this before a judge. I felt a surge of hope for the first time since learning about the foreclosure. Finally, someone who understood the law and seemed genuinely outraged on my behalf. What are our chances? I asked. Turner didn't sugarcoat his answer, which I appreciated. The law is clearly on your side, he said, but these cases can get complicated. The HOA will argue they followed their bylaws, that they sent notices, that you failed to respond. They'll try to make it seem like they didn't know you were active military, despite your notification. The Hendersons are innocent buyers caught in the middle, which complicates things further. He straightened the papers on his desk with military precision. But I've fought and won cases like this before. The SCRA has teeth when properly applied. Over the next few days, Turner and I worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and building our case. We discovered that the HOA had a history of aggressive enforcement under Patricia Winters' leadership. 2 other homeowners had faced similar excessive fines for minor violations, though neither had progressed to foreclosure. We obtained copies of all the violation notices through a formal legal request. Most were for infractions so minor they were almost comical. A branch extending 3 inches over a sidewalk, a welcome mat not on the approved list, grass half an inch too tall. But there was nothing funny about how these trivial issues had been weaponized to steal my home. Turner also uncovered something disturbing in the auction records. The winning bidder, who paid just $3,500 for my $300,000 home, was a company called PKR Investments. Further investigation revealed that PKR stood for Patricia Keller Realty, a small real estate company jointly owned by Patricia Winters and Robert Keller. They had essentially orchestrated the entire situation to acquire my property at a fraction of its value. "This is fraud, plain and simple," Turner said when he showed me the connection. "They created violations, refused your payments, ignored your communications, rushed the foreclosure while knowing you were deployed, and then bought the property themselves through a shell company. Every step of this was calculated." The most painful discovery came when we found evidence that my HOA fee payments had indeed been processed but then deliberately applied to a reserve account rather than credited to my property. In other words, they took my money, hid it in their accounting system, and then claimed I hadn't paid. The magnitude of the deception was staggering. These weren't just procedural errors or overzealous rule enforcement. This was a coordinated scheme to steal my property. While Turner prepared our legal filings, I stayed in a cheap extended-stay hotel on the outskirts of town. My savings were dwindling fast. Military pay doesn't go far, and the legal fees, even with Turner's military discount, were substantial. I had to call my mother and explain that her move to Colorado would be delayed. "I'm so sorry, Mom," I said, my throat tight with emotion. "The house, there's been a problem." I tried to explain the situation without alarming her too much about her own future. "Don't you worry about me," she said, with the resilience that had carried her through my father's death and my multiple deployments. "You just focus on getting your house back. I can wait a little longer." Her faith in me was both comforting and added pressure. I couldn't let her down. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late November. Turner had prepared me well, explaining that this wasn't the main trial, but rather a hearing to decide whether an injunction should be granted while the case proceeded. "Dress in your uniform," he advised, "not to play for sympathy, but to remind the court exactly who is being harmed here." I nodded, understanding the strategy. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about every service member who could face similar predatory actions while deployed. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with dark wood paneling and the inevitable American flag beside the judge's bench. Patricia Winters and Robert Keller sat at one table, with their attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. The Hendersons were at another table with their own lawyer, looking uncomfortable and out of place. I noticed several people in the gallery I didn't recognize, but Turner whispered that they were reporters from local news outlets. Steve had been busy spreading the word about my situation. Judge Raymond Ramirez entered the courtroom, and we all rose. He was a stern-looking man in his 60s, with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. As he reviewed the documents before him, I could feel the tension in the room building. Finally, he looked up and addressed the attorneys. "I've reviewed the initial filings in this case," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "and I have serious concerns about the actions taken by the Homeowners Association." I saw Patricia Winters shift uncomfortably in her seat. "Counsel for the HOA, perhaps you can explain to me why a property belonging to an active duty service member deployed in Iraq was foreclosed upon without a court order, in direct violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act." The HOA's attorney stood, adjusting his tie nervously. "Your Honor, my clients followed all proper procedures according to their bylaws. Multiple notices were sent to the property regarding violations and unpaid fines. Mr. Carter never responded to these notices, nor did he make arrangements for property maintenance during his absence." Turner was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, my client notified the HOA of his deployment before leaving. He paid his regular dues in advance. He made arrangements for property maintenance. The alleged violations were minor and arguably fabricated. And most importantly, the SCRA explicitly prohibits exactly this type of foreclosure without court approval. regardless of HOA. Judge Ramirez nodded slowly, his expression growing sterner by the minute. I'm inclined to agree with counsel for the plaintiff, he said. The evidence suggests the HOA was aware of Sergeant Carter's military status and proceeded with foreclosure anyway, in clear violation of federal law. He turned to the Hendersons' attorney. Unfortunately, your clients appear to be innocent victims in this situation. They purchased the property in good faith, but if the sale was illegal from the start, their claim to ownership is on shaky ground. Michael Henderson paled visibly at these words. The judge continued, addressing all parties. I'm granting the preliminary injunction. The property will remain in its current state, no further renovations, no occupancy changes, until this case is resolved. And I'm expediting the trial date given the serious nature of these allegations. He fixed Patricia Winters with a hard stare. I'm also ordering the HOA to produce all documents related to this foreclosure, including board meeting minutes, communication records, and financial transactions. If there has been deliberate misconduct here, this court will get to the bottom of it. As we left the courtroom, Patricia and Robert hurried past, avoiding eye contact. Turner placed a hand on my shoulder. First round goes to us, he said quietly, but they'll come back fighting. They have too much to lose if this goes public. I nodded, watching the Hendersons speak anxiously with their attorney. What about them? I asked. They didn't know what they were getting into, Turner sighed. They're victims too in a way. If we win, they'll have grounds to sue the HOA for selling them a property illegally, but that won't be your concern. For the first time since returning home, I felt a glimmer of real hope. The system that I had fought to protect overseas was now fighting for me. But as Turner had warned, this battle was far from over. The weeks leading up to the trial were a blur of depositions, document reviews, and strategy sessions. Turner worked tirelessly, building our case piece by piece, meticulous piece. The documents Judge Ramirez had ordered revealed even more than we'd expected. Board meeting minutes showed that Patricia and Robert had specifically discussed my deployment as an opportunity. Email exchanges revealed their plan to target my property because of its prime corner location and resale potential. Most damning, we found evidence that they had deliberately diverted my advance HOA payments to make it appear that I hadn't paid. The HOA's attorneys offered a settlement 2 days before trial, $20,000, and an NDA preventing me from discussing the case. They're desperate, Turner explained. They know how bad this looks, and they're trying to bury it before the media gets wind of the details. I didn't hesitate in my response. I don't want their money. I want my house back, and I want them held accountable so they can't do this to anyone else. Turner nodded with a hint of pride in his eyes, seemingly pleased that I wasn't taking the easy way out. The morning of the trial arrived with a surprising development. Diane Thomas, the retired school teacher from the HOA board, contacted Turner asking to testify on my behalf. I can't stay silent any longer, she told us, hands trembling as she clutched her purse. What they did to you was wrong, and I should have fought harder to stop it. I've been losing sleep ever since this whole thing started. Her testimony would be crucial, an insider confirming that the board had knowingly violated the law. The courtroom was packed when the trial began. News of the case had spread throughout the military community, and several rows were filled with service members in uniform, many of whom I'd never met. My mother had made the journey as well, despite her doctor's concerns about the travel, sitting in the front row with determination etched on her face. The sight of her there, waiting to see if we would get back the home I'd promised her, strengthened my resolve even further. Turner presented our case methodically, laying out the timeline from my deployment notification to the fraudulent auction. I testified first, recounting my experience in clear terms, the advance payments I'd made, the arrangements with Steve, the frantic emails from Iraq. The HOA's attorney tried to paint me as negligent during cross-examination. Sergeant Carter, he asked with feigned concern, don't you think it was irresponsible to leave a property unattended for 15 months? I met his gaze steadily. I was serving my country in a combat zone. I made every reasonable arrangement possible, including notifying your clients of my deployment and paying my dues in advance. The only irresponsible parties are those who targeted my home because I wasn't there to defend it. Steve testified next, describing his attempts to maintain the property and his confusion over the mounting violations. Then came Diane Thomas, whose insider testimony proved devastating to the HOA's case. She described board meetings where Patricia and Robert openly discussed using foreclosures to acquire undervalued properties. They called it cleaning up the neighborhood, she said, but it was really about finding vulnerable homeowners they could target. They specifically mentioned military personnel as easy targets because they're often away for extended periods. When Patricia finally took the stand, her earlier confidence had evaporated. Under Turner's skilled cross-examination, she contradicted herself repeatedly, first claiming she hadn't known about my military status, then admitting she might have heard something about it. When confronted with the email exchanges showing their deliberate targeting of my property, she attempted to dismiss them as just brainstorming. The courtroom audience murmured in disbelief at her transparent attempts to rewrite history. Just when it seemed the case couldn't get any stronger, the HOA's attorney produced a document purportedly signed by me, waiving my rights under the SCRA. "Your move just backfired," Turner whispered to me with quiet confidence. He immediately requested to examine the document and asked for a handwriting expert. The judge ordered a brief recess while a court-appointed handwriting analyst examined the document. The analyst's conclusion was unequivocal. "This is not Sergeant Carter's signature. Based on comparison with known examples of his handwriting, this document has been falsified." Judge Ramirez's expression darkened as he regarded Patricia and Robert. "Counselor, I strongly suggest you confer with your clients about the serious implications of submitting fraudulent evidence to this court." After a brief consultation, Robert Keller unexpectedly asked to address the court. "Your Honor, I wish to revise my earlier testimony." Patricia shot him a venomous look, but he continued. "The document was created after we learned of Sergeant Carter's legal action. Patricia suggested that we needed something to counter his SCRA claims." What followed was a complete confession. Robert detailed how they had targeted my property specifically because of its value and my absence, how they had manipulated the violation process, hidden my payments, and arranged the auction to ensure their shell company would acquire the property. By the time he finished, Patricia sat rigid with fury, and Judge Ramirez was making notes with sharp, angry strokes of his pen. Having heard all the evidence, the judge announced, "I am prepared to rule. The foreclosure and subsequent sale of Sergeant Carter's property are hereby declared null and void as violations of the Service Members' Civil Relief Act. Ownership is to be returned to Sergeant Carter immediately." He addressed the Hendersons. "As innocent purchasers of an illegally foreclosed property, you have grounds for a separate action against the HOA for full reimbursement." Finally, he addressed Patricia and Robert directly. "As for the defendants, this court refers this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of fraud, falsification of evidence, and perjury charges. Additionally, I am ordering a complete audit of all HOA activities during your tenure." As the judge's gavel came down, the courtroom erupted in applause. My mother made her way to the front, tears streaming down her face as she embraced me. "You did it," she whispered. "You got our home back." The Hendersons approached cautiously, Michael extending his hand. "We're sorry for what happened. We never would have bought the house if we'd known." I shook his hand, understanding they too had been victims of Patricia and Robert's scheme. As Patricia and Robert were escorted out, surrounded by reporters shouting questions, I felt no triumph or vindication. Only relief that this ordeal was finally over, and that the home I had worked so hard for would once again be mine. The battle I had fought here might have been different from the one in Iraq, but it had been just as important, and like any good soldier, I had refused to surrender when the fight mattered most. The return to my home was both joyful and bittersweet. The Hendersons had been given 14 days to vacate, which they did with remarkable grace considering their situation. They had already begun renovations, new kitchen countertops, fresh paint in several rooms, improvements I would never have chosen but now benefited from. The court had ordered the HOA to compensate them fully, not just for the purchase price, but for all their renovation costs and moving expenses. It seemed like the only fair resolution for a family caught in someone else's fraud. On the day I received the new keys to my own front door, Steve and several neighbors came by to help me move back in. My possessions had been stored in Steve's garage after the Hendersons found more of my things in the attic and basement. Some items were damaged or missing, particularly several military medals and family photographs that had been in the containers left outside. But the important things, my grandfather's watch, my father's flag from his military funeral, the photo albums chronicling my mother's life, those had survived. The news coverage of the case had generated an unexpected wave of support. Veterans groups reached out, offering assistance with home repairs and furnishings. A local furniture store donated a new bedroom set for my mother. Neighbors I had never even met before my deployment stopped by with casseroles and welcome back cards. In the midst of all the chaos and injustice, I discovered a community I hadn't known existed. Patricia and Robert were facing serious legal consequences. The district attorney had filed multiple charges against them, including fraud, falsification of documents, and perjury. The state real estate board suspended Patricia's license, pending investigation, effectively ending her career. Robert faced potential disbarment. Their actions had cost them everything they had sought to gain, and more. I took no pleasure in their downfall, only relief that they couldn't harm anyone else the way they had harmed me. The case had attracted attention beyond our local community. A state senator, himself a veteran, contacted me about strengthening protections for deployed military personnel. "What happened to you shouldn't be possible," he told me during a meeting at his office. "The SCRA has teeth, but clearly some organizations think they can work around it. We need to close those loopholes." He proposed legislation, which he called the Carter Protection Act, requiring HOAs to verify military status before initiating any foreclosure proceedings, with triple damages for violations. The bill gained bipartisan support almost immediately. More importantly, other service members began coming forward with similar stories, not just about HOAs, but about landlords, storage companies, and other businesses that had taken advantage of their deployments. My case had shone a light on a problem more widespread than anyone had realized. Turner, my attorney, began taking on some of these cases pro bono, determined to establish stronger precedents protecting military personnel. "Your case is going to help a lot of people," he told me. "Sometimes it takes one person standing up to change the system." 6 weeks after the court ruling, my mother finally moved in. I had spent every spare moment preparing the house for her arrival, installing grab bars in the bathroom, adding a ramp alongside the front steps, ensuring everything was accessible for her increasingly limited mobility. When the van bringing her from the airport pulled into the driveway, I felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked me over. This was what I had fought for, both in Iraq and in that courtroom. Not just a house, but a home for the woman who had sacrificed so much for me throughout my life. As I helped her from the car, supporting her elbow as she took careful steps toward the front door, she paused to look at the house. "It's even prettier than in the pictures," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never doubted you would get it back, Logan. Not for a minute." I squeezed her hand gently. "Welcome home, Mom," I said, my own voice barely steady. "I promised you a home, and a soldier always keeps his promises." The afternoon was spent showing her around, arranging her belongings in her new bedroom, and sitting together on the back patio watching birds at the feeder Steve had installed as a welcome back gift. It was the simple moment of peace I had dreamed about during the long hot nights in Iraq. Just being home, with my mother, safe and secure in a place that belonged to us. That evening, as we sat at the kitchen table enjoying a meal brought over by Diane Thomas, who had become a regular visitor and unexpected friend, my mother asked a question I hadn't anticipated. "Are you angry, Logan, about what they tried to do to you?" I considered this carefully, stirring my coffee as I thought. I finally answered. "Furious, actually. But now, I'm just grateful we won, that the system eventually worked, and I'm determined to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The changes rippled outward from our community. The Carter Protection Act passed unanimously in our state legislature and was being considered in several other states. The HOA in our neighborhood was completely restructured, with transparent new policies and a board comprised primarily of resident homeowners rather than real estate professionals. Patricia and Robert both pled guilty to reduced charges, receiving probation and substantial fines rather than jail time, an outcome I supported, believing that restitution was more valuable than. 6 months after returning from Iraq, I stood on my front porch, watching the American flag I had installed fluttering in the spring breeze. My mother was tending to the flower beds with the help of a neighbor's teenage daughter. Across the street, Steve waved as he collected his mail. The neighborhood felt different now, not just a collection of houses with matching roof lines, but a community that had come together in the face of injustice. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on distant battlefields, but in courtrooms, community meetings, and the quiet determination to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem overwhelming. My military training had taught me never to surrender when something important was at stake. That lesson served me well in Iraq, but it proved even more valuable when fighting for my home. As I watched my mother smile at something the neighbor's daughter said, I felt a profound sense of peace. The house was secure, my mother was happy, the people who had tried to take advantage of my service had faced justice, And perhaps most importantly, the system I had risked my life to defend had ultimately defended me in return. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but in the end, justice had prevailed. And that is my story, how I reclaimed my $300,000 house that an HOA sold for just $3,500 while I was serving in Iraq. If you're a service member or know someone who is facing a similar situation, remember that the SCRA exists to protect you. Fight for your rights because they're worth fighting for. And if my story has made a difference to you, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because every time we share stories like this, we help another soldier know that their rights are worth protecting, even while they're protecting us.
QA stories where neighbors feud, secrets spill, and karma always clocks in. Stick around, we've got receipts.